February 13, 1943. Above the jungle-shrouded coastline of Guadalcanal, the air smells of salt, smoke, and something older, something primal. Lieutenant Commander Tom Blackburn of the United States Navy is seated in the cockpit of an aircraft that most of his superiors weren't entirely sure they wanted. The machine beneath him is ungainly by conventional standards. Its wings bend sharply downward near the root, then angle sharply outward again, a distinctive, almost grotesque inverted gull configuration that drew more than a few derisive comments from the men who first laid eyes on it. The Japanese pilots who had heard scattered reports of this new American fighter called it, among other things, a curiosity. Some called it unstable. Some called it overrated. They were wrong. They simply did not yet know it. The Vought F4U Corsair, bent-winged, snarling, and brutally fast, was about to write one of the most dominant chapters in the entire history of aerial warfare. By the time the Pacific War ended in August 1945, the Corsair would accumulate an aerial kill ratio of 11-1 against Imperial Japanese aircraft. It would fly more than 64,000 combat sorties. It would emerge as arguably the finest carrier-capable fighter of the Second World War, though it would earn that status the hard way, through blood, fire, mechanical refinement, and the slow, grinding crucible of real combat. But none of that is visible on this February morning. On this morning, there is only the distant hum of radial engines, the green maze of jungle below, and the absolute certainty among Japan's most experienced aviators that their beloved Mitsubishi A6M Zero still owned the sky above the Pacific. They would not own it for much longer. The mathematics of dominance. Let us begin where historians and tacticians alike so often fail to begin, with the final accounting. By the conclusion of hostilities in the Pacific Theater, the F4U Corsair had registered 2,140 confirmed aerial victories against enemy aircraft. Against those losses, only 189 Corsairs were destroyed in air-to-air combat. The ratio is stark, almost disorienting in its lopsidedness. 11 enemy aircraft destroyed for every Corsair lost in a dogfight. In a war where attrition was frequently measured in thin margins, this was not a thin margin. This was a landslide. The numbers demand context. The Mitsubishi A6M Zero, Japan's iconic near-legendary carrier fighter, entered the war with a kill ratio that made Western observers physically uncomfortable. In China, in the opening months of the Pacific War, Zero pilots had accumulated records of aerial dominance that bordered on the mythological. A handful of veterans had individual scores exceeding 50 kills. Their machine seemed to those who encountered it in the first bewildering months of war almost supernatural in its agility. Yet against the Corsair, this legend unraveled with a speed that shocked even the most astute American analysts. Not all at once, not in a single afternoon, but with the grinding inevitability of an industrial civilization bringing its full weight to bear on a warrior culture that had confused initial supremacy with permanent superiority. In hindsight, the outcome was inevitable. The question that demands examination is not whether the Corsair would eventually dominate. It is why so many people on both sides of the conflict failed to see it coming. The Zero and the mythology of perfection. To understand why Japanese aviators underestimated the Corsair, one must first understand what the Zero represented to Imperial Japan and to the world. When the A6M2 entered operational service in 1940, it was, by almost any objective measure, the finest carrier-based fighter on Earth. It could outclimb, outturn, and outrange virtually every opponent it faced in the opening months of the Pacific War. Its combat radius of approximately 1,600 miles gave it reach that stunned Allied planners. Its rate of climb, capable of reaching 20,000 feet in just over 7 minutes, left many Western fighters struggling simply to gain altitude before the engagement was already decided. The Zero was the product of a very specific design philosophy, one articulated most clearly by chief designer Jiro Horikoshi and the Imperial Japanese Navy's demanding specification requirements. The Navy wanted a fighter that could escort bombers over vast oceanic distances, engage any adversary in a turning fight, and operate from Japan's fleet carriers. Horikoshi delivered all of it, but at a price that, in the early months of war, seemed entirely acceptable. To achieve its extraordinary performance figures, The Zero was built to a standard of lightness that bordered on the ascetic. It weighed, at combat load, approximately 6,000 pounds, roughly half the weight of several contemporary American fighters. This was achieved by stripping away everything the Imperial Navy's specification did not explicitly demand: armor plate for the pilot, self-sealing fuel tanks, structural redundancy. These were not oversights. These were conscious sacrifices, made in the belief that a Zero pilot would never need them, because a Zero pilot would never be in a position where they were required. The doctrine embedded in this design was one of pure offensive aggression. The Zero was built not to survive being shot at, but to ensure that it never was. Pilot skill combined with aircraft agility would render the question of armored protection essentially irrelevant. It was a beautiful logic. It was also, as history would demonstrate, a catastrophically brittle one. In the winter of 1941 and the spring of 1942, none of this brittleness was visible. Japanese naval aviation was at the absolute apex of its power and skill. The aviators who had trained for years, who had hardened themselves in the skies above China, who flew their machines with an intimacy bordering on the spiritual, these men were, individually, among the finest combat pilots on Earth. When they looked at early reports of the new American bent-wing fighter, many of them did not feel threatened. They felt curious, perhaps mildly amused. Lieutenant Saburo Sakai, who would become Japan's most celebrated surviving ace with 64 confirmed kills, later recalled in his memoirs that initial assessments of the Corsair were dismissive. The aircraft's large radial engine and bent wing made it look, to some veteran Zero pilots, like an aircraft designed by committee. Powerful, perhaps, but lacking the elegance and responsiveness they associated with a truly superior fighter. What they did not know, could not fully know from the fragmentary intelligence available to them, was precisely what that bent wing contained and what that enormous engine was capable of unleashing. The bent wing and the engine that changed everything. The Vought F4U Corsair was not, in origin, an aircraft designed for grace. It was designed around an engine. Specifically, it was designed around the Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp, an 18-cylinder air-cooled radial power plant that in its initial production variants produced 2,000 horsepower. In later variants, with water injection and other refinements, it would produce over 2,400 horsepower. In 1940, this engine was the most powerful aircraft power plant available to American designers. The challenge was making it work. The R2800 demanded the largest propeller that aerodynamic physics and structural engineering could practically construct. The Hamilton Standard hydromatic propeller fitted to the Corsair measured 13 feet 4 inches in diameter, 13 feet and 4 inches. On a conventional aircraft with straight wings and conventional landing gear geometry, this propeller would simply strike the ground during takeoff and landing. The solution, devised by Vaught's engineering team under Rex Beisel, was radical: bend the wings. By incorporating the distinctive inverted gull wing, which swept downward sharply from the fuselage, then angled back upward to the wingtips, the designers could shorten the main landing gear legs dramatically, while still clearing the enormous propeller disc. The bent wing was not an aesthetic choice. It was a brutally pragmatic engineering solution. But in solving the propeller clearance problem, Vaught's engineers inadvertently created something else: a structural and aerodynamic platform of unusual rigidity and strength. The bent wing section, where the gull angle changed direction, created a structural joint of extraordinary integrity. The Corsair's airframe could absorb punishment that would have dismembered more conventionally constructed fighters. Where the Zero was built to be untouchable through agility, the Corsair was built to be survivable through strength. The performance numbers that resulted from pairing this airframe with the R2800 was startling. The F4U, one in early production configuration, could reach a maximum speed of 417 miles per hour at 19,900 feet. This made it, at the time of its introduction, the fastest fighter in the United States Navy's inventory, and one of the fastest piston-engine aircraft anywhere on Earth. The Zero's maximum speed was approximately 331 miles per hour. The gap between these two figures, 86 miles per hour, sounds like a simple statistic. In aerial combat, it was an enormous, almost insurmountable tactical reality. Speed translates into choice. A faster aircraft can choose when to engage and when to disengage. It can dictate the geometry of the fight. It can dive away from trouble and climb back to altitude with an energy advantage that a slower opponent cannot match. The Zero pilot who found himself beneath a diving Corsair was not facing a fair contest. He was facing a machine that could accelerate past him before he had completed his turn to meet it, then climb back above him before he could bring his weapons to bear. The Zero's extraordinary turning radius, its greatest tactical asset against most opponents, became largely irrelevant against an enemy who declined to turn with it. The Corsair's armament underscored this advantage. 6 Browning M2.50 caliber machine guns, 3 mounted in each wing, each capable of firing at 750 to 850 rounds per minute. Harmonized to converge at a point ahead of the aircraft, these 6 guns produced a combined weight of fire of approximately 7.6 pounds of lead and steel per second. Against the Zero's unarmored fuel tanks and unprotected pilot position, a single solid burst from a Corsair's guns was frequently all that was required. The Zero, by contrast, carried 2 7.7mm machine guns firing through the propeller arc and 2 2mm Type 99 cannons in the wings. The 20mm cannons were powerful but slow firing, 490 rounds per minute combined, and their drum magazines carried only 60 rounds each in early variants, rising to 100 rounds in later models. The 7.7mm guns were effective only at close range. A Zero pilot needed to get close, needed to hold his position in a deflection shot, needed time to line up the geometry correctly. Against an aircraft that could change direction and accelerate before that geometry was achieved, the Zero's weapons were frequently never brought to bear at all. First blood over Guadalcanal, the first large-scale encounter between the Corsair and Japanese Airpower in the Pacific, occurred not in the triumphant conditions that American planners had envisioned, but in a context of considerable chaos and mechanical uncertainty. The Marine Corps' VMF 124, under the command of Major William Geese, became the first Corsair-equipped unit to see combat in February 1943. The early engagements were not the overwhelming American victories that the Corsair's technical specifications should have predicted. The problem was not the aircraft. The problem was that the men flying it were still learning its character, its handling, its quirks. And the Corsair had many quirks. The aircraft had a vicious torque reaction on takeoff that could flip an inattentive pilot before he had left the ground. It had a tendency to snap roll at low speeds if the throttle was mishandled. Landing aboard carriers presented its own horrifying complications. The long nose, necessary to house the R-2800's accessory section, created a blind spot directly forward of the cockpit on approach that made judging the carrier deck's position essentially an exercise in faith. For these reasons, the Corsair was initially deemed unsuitable for carrier operations and assigned almost exclusively to land-based Marine Corps and Navy squadrons. But the men who learned the Corsair's temperament, who understood that it required not the gentle coaxing a Zero pilot applied to his responsive, nervous machine, but the confident, assertive handling of a powerful thoroughbred. These men began to develop a relationship with their aircraft that would prove devastating to Imperial Japanese aviation. The engagement of April 7, 1943, provided the first clear demonstration of what the Corsair could do when properly employed. Japanese forces launched a massive air offensive, Operation Igo, from Rabaul, throwing approximately 67 Zeros and other aircraft against Allied shipping and installations at Guadalcanal and Tulagi. Corsairs from VMF 124 and other Marine squadrons rose to meet them. In the fighting that day, American pilots claimed multiple kills at a favorable ratio, though official figures would be contested and refined by subsequent analysis. What was not contested was the pattern that emerged: Corsairs engaging from above, using speed and diving attacks, then climbing back to altitude before the Zeros could turn to meet them. The high-speed slashing attack, utterly at odds with the turning dogfight that Japanese doctrine and Zero performance favored. Second Lieutenant Kenneth Walsh, who would become one of the earliest Corsair aces, described the experience of his first major engagements with characteristic directness. "You had to know what to do and when not to do it," he said. You never turned with a zero below 250 miles per hour. You never. If you got slow, you were dead. But if you kept your speed, kept your altitude advantage, the Corsair was a killing machine. Walsh would eventually accumulate 21 confirmed kills, earning the Medal of Honor in the process. For the Japanese pilots who survived those early encounters, the experience was disorienting in a way that went beyond mere surprise at an opponent's speed. The psychological framework within which they had trained, fought, and developed their entire professional identity was built on an assumption that superior skill would always manifest as superior turning performance, that the dance of the dogfight, the intricate, swirling contest of angles and deflection and throttle management, was the ultimate test of a fighter pilot's worth. The Corsair refused to dance. It struck, and it left, and striking and leaving, it killed. The Thach weave, and the architecture of systemic superiority, individual courage, and individual skill are not what win wars. Wars are won by systems, by doctrine, by the capacity of an institution to learn from failure, incorporate new information, refine its methods, and apply them consistently across thousands of engagements involving hundreds of thousands of men. The United States Navy and Marine Corps, for all their early fumbling, possessed this institutional capacity in abundance. Imperial Japan did not, or more precisely, Imperial Japan possessed it in theory, but found its practical application obstructed by the very cultural frameworks that had made its military so formidable in the first place. The Thach weave, named for Lieutenant Commander John Jimmy Thach, who devised it as a tactical antidote to the Zero's performance advantages, illustrated this asymmetry with painful clarity. Thach developed his weave as a two-aircraft defensive maneuver, a choreographed pattern in which a pair of fighters flew parallel courses and crossed each other's tails in a continuous scissoring motion. An attacking Zero that followed one aircraft through the weave would inevitably find itself in the gunsight of the other. It was simple, it was elegant, and it was the product of systematic, analytical thinking applied to a concrete tactical problem. American fighter doctrine underwent a revolution in the first 18 months of Pacific combat that was, in institutional terms, remarkable for its speed and completeness. The early disasters, the destruction of unprepared squadrons at Pearl Harbor, Wake Island, the Philippines, the early carrier battles, generated not paralysis, but urgent inquiry. What had gone wrong? Why had Japanese aircraft performed as they had? What could be done? Analysts at the Naval Air Station in Anacostia and at training establishments across the country worked with surviving combat pilots to develop new tactics, new training regimens, new approaches to the essential problems of aerial combat. The answer they converged upon was a fundamental rejection of the individual skill-first philosophy that had dominated pre-war thinking. American fighter tactics would henceforth be built around the two-aircraft section, the wingman system, in which no pilot flew alone and mutual protection was institutionalized into the basic tactical unit. Pilots would be trained not to match the Zero in a turning contest, but to deny it the terms of engagement it preferred. Energy management, maintaining speed and altitude advantage, would be drilled until it was reflex. Japanese aviation, meanwhile, underwent its own evolution, but at a pace and with an effectiveness that could not match what American industry and training institutions were producing. The fundamental doctrine of the Zero, built around the exceptional skill of individual pilots, contained within it a catastrophic vulnerability. It was dependent on the continued availability of those exceptional pilots. When they died, the doctrine died with them, and they were dying. The black sheep and the systematic destruction no story of the Corsair in the Pacific can proceed far without arriving at the name Gregory Pappy Boyington. To call Boyington colorful is to commit a significant understatement. He was a decorated veteran of the American volunteer group, the Flying Tigers, who had accumulated kills against Japanese aircraft in China before the United States formally entered the war. He was a drinker, a brawler, a man who inspired intense loyalty in those who served under him and intense exasperation in those who commanded him. He was also, in the cockpit of a Corsair, a virtuoso of aerial destruction. In August 1943, Boyington was given command of Marine Fighter Attack Squadron 214, VMF 214, assembled from a collection of replacement pilots and aviators who had been separated from their original units. He named them, with characteristic dark humor, the Black Sheep. What he built from this unpromising material over the following months was a demonstration of what the Corsair, properly led and properly employed, could accomplish. Between September 1943 and January 1944, VMF 214 flew 84 days of combat operations in the Solomons campaign. In that period, Boyington's squadron destroyed 97 Japanese aircraft confirmed, with numerous probables. Boyington himself added 28 aerial victories to bring his total to 28, tying the record then held by the legendary Eddie Rickenbacker. The tactics he used were those now becoming standard American doctrine: altitude advantage, speed, the slashing dive and climb attack, the wingman system. Against these tactics, even the most experienced Japanese pilots found themselves at a structural disadvantage that individual skill alone could not overcome. The broader numbers from the Solomons campaign of 1943 told a story that was becoming impossible to ignore. In the air battles around Rabaul and the northern Solomons, American fighter forces, Corsairs foremost among them, alongside the Grumman F-6F Hellcat, operating from carrier decks, were achieving kill ratios that reflected not just tactical advantage, but a fundamental shift in the balance of quality and quantity. Japanese forces were losing experienced pilots at a rate they could not sustain. American forces were absorbing losses and replacing them with pilots trained in the new doctrine, trained in the new aircraft, trained in systems that made the individual less dependent on exceptional personal skill. By the end of 1943, the pattern was established. By the spring of 1944, it was becoming mathematically irreversible. The great carrier battles of 1944, the Philippine Sea in June, Leyte Gulf in October, completed what the Solomons campaign had begun. Japanese carrier aviation, the arm that had shattered the American battle fleet at Pearl Harbor, and had seemed, in early 1942, to be on the verge of establishing permanent naval dominance across the Pacific, was effectively destroyed. Not just damaged, destroyed. The Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, as American pilots would call the air battles of the Philippine Sea engagement, resulted in the loss of approximately 476 Japanese aircraft in a single day. American losses were fewer than 130. The pilots who survived the Turkey Shoot came home to carriers and airfields. Most of the Japanese pilots did not. The structural knowledge embedded in those experienced men, the tens of thousands of flight hours, the hard-won combat instincts, the ability to lead and train the next generation, went with them to the bottom of the Pacific Ocean. The dying of the light. Japan's pilot crisis. There is a number that more than any other explains the collapse of Japanese air power over the Pacific. In 1941, Imperial Japan possessed approximately 3,500 highly trained naval aviators. These men were the product of a selection and training process of extraordinary rigor. Japanese naval aviation training in the pre-war years lasted a minimum of 2 years and frequently extended to 3 or 4, combining academic instruction in navigation, aerodynamics, and tactics with flying hours that were, by any international standard, extraordinary. The pilots who emerged from this system were not merely capable, they were, as the opening months of the war demonstrated, among the most lethal aviators on Earth. The system could not be quickly replicated. The quality it produced was the product of time, of cumulative experience, of the irreplaceable process by which a raw trainee becomes a combat-hardened veteran. Japan had no mechanism for accelerating this process without degrading its output, and the Imperial Japanese Navy, shaped by its traditions and its culture, was profoundly resistant to the compromises that acceleration would require. The losses of 1942 and 1943 were catastrophic and irreplaceable in every meaningful sense. At the Coral Sea, at Midway, in the Solomons campaign, the men who died were not simply pilots. They were the irreplaceable repositories of accumulated expertise. When Petty Officer Hiroyoshi Nishizawa, perhaps the deadliest Zero pilot of the entire war, a man whose confirmed kills exceeded 100 in some accounts, was killed in a transport aircraft ambushed by Hellcats in October 1944. Japan did not lose a pilot. Japan lost a generation. Contrast this with the American experience. The United States Army Air Forces, and the United States Navy had, by 1943, constructed training pipelines of extraordinary scale and surprising effectiveness. The Naval Aviation Cadet Program, NAVCAD, was processing tens of thousands of candidates annually through a curriculum that, while shorter than Japan's pre-war standard, had been refined by combat feedback to an exceptional degree. The University of Glenview, the naval air stations at Pensacola, Corpus Christi, Jacksonville, these were factories of competent, doctrine-equipped fighter pilots, men who might lack the individual panache of Japan's pre-war aces, but who flew in systems designed to compensate for individual deficiencies. By late 1944, the human arithmetic was beyond salvage. Japanese training programs, desperate for bodies to fill cockpits, were graduating pilots with as few as 40 to 80 hours of total flight time before declaring them combat-ready. The American standard was 500 hours or more. A young Japanese pilot dispatched to defend Formosa or the Philippines in October 1944 was, in many cases, a man who had barely mastered straight and level flight. Thrust into a combat environment against men who had trained for 18 months in advanced tactics and who flew machines of absolute technical superiority. The results were not combat. They were executions. The Corsair pilots who flew combat air patrol over the Leyte Gulf landings described encountering Japanese aircraft whose pilots seemed to have no tactical awareness whatsoever. Aircraft that flew straight and level in the presence of known enemy fighters, that failed to take evasive action when attacked, that seemed almost not to understand that the war they had entered was something different from the war their predecessors had fought. These men were not cowards. They were untrained. They were sacrificed. And then, from the depths of this desperation, Japan turned to something darker still. The kamikaze program, formally organized in October 1944, under Admiral Takejiro Onishi, was not, as it is sometimes misunderstood, a simple expression of Japanese warrior culture or military fanaticism. It was a rational response to an irrational situation. If trained pilots could no longer survive long enough to damage American ships through conventional attack, then perhaps untrained pilots, flying aircraft loaded with explosives, could accomplish through single-minded sacrifice what skilled combat no longer could. The mathematics were appalling but straightforward. A man who expected to survive could not be expected to fly his aircraft into a ship's deck. A man who did not expect to survive had no such reservation. The fury over Okinawa, the final reckoning, Operation Iceberg, the invasion of Okinawa, launched on April 1, 1945, was in the history of Pacific air combat both the culmination of everything that had come before and a revelation of how completely the strategic situation had shifted. Okinawa was close to the Japanese home islands. Japanese planners understood that if Okinawa fell, the next step would be the invasion of Kyushu itself. The defense of Okinawa was therefore not simply a military operation. It was, in the minds of Japanese high command, an existential moment. The response was the largest and most sustained kamikaze offensive of the entire war. Between April and June 1945, Japan launched 10 major organized kamikaze attacks, the Kikusui operations, involving nearly 1,900 aircraft, plus thousands more in conventional and semi-conventional attacks. It was the last throw of a dying air force, an act of organized self-immolation, on a scale that had no precedent in the history of warfare. Against this offensive, the Corsair proved its value not merely as a fighter, but as a multi-role combat aircraft of extraordinary adaptability. Operating from the newly captured airstrips on Okinawa itself and from escort carriers stationed offshore, Corsairs flew combat air patrol duties in numbers and at intensities that would have seemed unimaginable to the men who had struggled with the aircraft's carrier qualification problems 2 years earlier. Major Joseph Lynch of VMF 323, flying from Kadena Airfield on Okinawa, described operations during the Kikusui attacks in terms of controlled ferocity. "We were up before dawn, and we stayed up until we couldn't stay up anymore. Some days we flew 4 or 5 sorties. The Japanese kept coming, and we kept killing them, and it never seemed to end." In the air battles above the Okinawa invasion fleet, Corsairs, working in coordination with Hellcats and the ship-based anti-aircraft systems of the most powerful naval force in history, destroyed kamikaze aircraft by the hundreds. The kill rates were extraordinary. VMF 323 The Death Rattlers shot down 124 Japanese aircraft in a 2-week period during the initial stages of the invasion, not over the course of a campaign. 2 weeks. The mathematics of this performance are worth pausing to consider. 124 aircraft, averaging nearly 9 per day, in a period when the United States Navy was simultaneously fighting the most intense naval campaign in the Pacific War's history, and yet the kamikazes still got through. Some of them always got through. 36 American ships were sunk during the Okinawa campaign, more than in any other single operation of the Pacific War. Nearly 400 more were damaged. The Corsair's flying combat air patrol could not be everywhere at once. Against an opponent who had abandoned the concept of survival, even an 11-to-1 kill ratio meant that for every 11 aircraft destroyed before they reached the fleet, 1 got through. And 1 aircraft, flown by a man who did not intend to pull away, could turn a destroyer into a burning wreck. But the aggregate numbers told the story clearly. Japanese air power, measured in trained pilots and combat-worthy aircraft, had effectively ceased to exist as a meaningful military instrument. Of the approximately 1,900 kamikaze aircraft dispatched during the Kikusui operations, roughly 14% reached their targets. The rest were destroyed by Corsairs, by Hellcats, by anti-aircraft fire, by mechanical failure, by the sheer weight of American defensive capacity. And each aircraft that did not return carried with it a pilot who, however briefly trained, would never be replaced. The factory and the farm. Why America won what Japan could not. Aviation warfare in the Second World War was, in its deepest structural reality, a competition between industrial systems, between the capacity of national economies to design, manufacture, transport, fuel, maintain and man complex weapon systems at unprecedented scale. Japan understood this when the war began. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the architect of Pearl Harbor, famously warned his superiors that he could guarantee effective operations for 6 months to a year, but that if the war extended beyond that, he could promise nothing. He understood the arithmetic. He lost the argument with those who did not. In 1944 alone, the United States produced 96,318 military aircraft of all types. Japan produced approximately 28,180. The raw ratio of production, roughly 3.4 to 1 in America's favor, does not capture the qualitative dimension of this disparity. American aircraft production was characterized by the application of mass production techniques borrowed from the automobile industry, by the standardization of components across different aircraft types, by the creation of supply chains of extraordinary resilience. The Vought plant in Stratford, Connecticut, was simultaneously producing Corsairs, while the Brewster and Goodyear companies produced their own variants, the F3A and FG1 respectively, under license. This redundancy of production, this institutional capacity to absorb bottlenecks and disruptions and keep the output flowing, was simply beyond Japan's industrial reach. The R2800 engine alone tells the story in microcosm. Pratt & Whitney produced 125,334 R2800 double wasp engines during the war, engines that powered not only the Corsair but the Hellcat, the P-47 Thunderbolt, the B-26 Marauder, and numerous other types. The production line at the East Hartford facility operated 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, achieving levels of output that would have seemed fantastical to pre-war planners. Each engine was a precision instrument of 18 cylinders, 2,800 cubic inches of displacement, intricate fuel and ignition systems, and the accumulated metallurgical knowledge of American industrial science. Japan produced excellent engines, the Nakajima Homare, the Mitsubishi Kinsei, but could not produce them in these quantities. The fuel and lubricant systems supporting American aviation are frequently overlooked in tactical analyses of the Pacific War, but were in logistical terms as important as the aircraft themselves. American aviation gasoline, refined to specifications developed in collaboration with the aviation industry, had consistently higher octane ratings than Japanese fuel. 100 octane as standard for frontline American aircraft versus 87 octane as the common Japanese standard, with 91 octane available in limited quantities. The difference in octane rating translated directly into the performance envelope available to aircraft designers. An engine running on 100-octane fuel could be tuned for higher compression ratios, generating more power from the same displacement. The Corsair's performance figures assume 100-octane fuel. On lesser grades, the R2800's output, and consequently the Corsair's speed advantage, would have been diminished. The training infrastructure that America built between 1942 and 1945 was itself an industrial achievement of the first order. The Naval Aviation Cadet Program, expanded from a pre-war capacity of a few hundred graduates per year to a wartime output of more than 20,000 annually, was the product of systematic investment in facilities, instructors, aircraft, and curriculum. The Link Trainer, an early flight simulator, allowed student pilots to develop instrument flying skills without consuming scarce aircraft hours. Gunnery training was revolutionized by the introduction of the gun camera, which allowed instructors to analyze a student's shooting geometry with a precision that verbal debriefing could never match. Two philosophies of war in the air. There is a deeper explanation beneath the statistics, beneath the production figures, and the octane ratings. It is an explanation that resists quantification but is no less real for that. It is a story about two fundamentally different theories of how air power works and what it requires. Japanese naval aviation was built on the concept of the exceptional individual. The Zero was designed to be the extension of a master craftsman's will, a tool of such sensitivity and responsiveness that it would amplify the abilities of the man who flew it, allowing his superior training and superior dedication to express themselves in a way that overcame any quantitative advantage an opponent might possess. This was not an irrational philosophy. In 1941, it worked. The pilots who executed Pearl Harbor, who swept through the East Indies and the Philippines and the Indian Ocean, were genuinely exceptional men flying an aircraft that enabled their exceptionalism. The problem was that this philosophy contained within it a catastrophic dependency. Remove the exceptional men, through combat attrition, through the grinding mathematics of a long war, and you are left with an aircraft designed around capabilities that its remaining pilots cannot fully exercise. The Zero in the hands of a 40-hour pilot was not an effective weapon. It was a liability. Its lightness, so valuable in a turning fight when piloted by a man who understood its limits exactly, became a death trap for a man whose instincts were not yet calibrated to its edge cases. Its lack of armor and self-sealing tanks, tolerable when the aircraft was consistently flown at a tactical advantage, became an execution sentence in engagements where that advantage did not exist. American doctrine, particularly as refined through the brutal lessons of 1942, moved in the opposite direction. It accepted, and in time actively embraced, the notion that the average quality of American pilots would frequently be lower than the average quality of their opponents. What American doctrine sought to do was create a system in which average pilots, flying in well-designed formation tactics with aircraft of absolute performance superiority, could defeat exceptional pilots flying in an aggressive but individualistic manner. The Thach weave was the most elegant expression of this philosophy. It required no exceptional skill from either pilot involved. It required coordination, communication, and discipline, institutional virtues that can be systematically trained, rather than the razor-edge individual performance that cannot be mass-produced. There is a profound irony in the fact that Japan's warrior culture, its celebration of the exceptional individual, its romanticization of sacrifice and mastery, ultimately undermined its own air force. A culture that venerated the individual made it psychologically difficult to institutionalize the wingman system in its full implications. The idea that the wingman's primary duty was not to shoot down aircraft, but to protect his leader, even at the expense of his own opportunities for glory. The Zero pilots who broke formation to pursue individual targets, who trusted their aircraft's agility to keep them safe, who sought the personal validation of the aerial kill, these men were not failures by their own culture's standards. They were exemplars of it. And they were dying. The final accounting. When the war ended on August 15, 1945, the final ledger of Pacific air combat had been written in numbers that admit of no ambiguity. The Corsair's 2,140 confirmed aerial victories against 189 losses in air-to-air combat produced a kill ratio of 11.3 to 1. Over the course of the war, Corsairs flew 64,051 combat sorties. They dropped 15,621 tons of bombs in ground attack missions. They fired 1,592 rockets at ground targets, ships, and aircraft. They consumed, in doing so, over 4.7 million rounds of .50 caliber ammunition. Against these figures, Japanese naval aviation, which had entered the war with a corps of pilots that may have been the finest in the world, had been effectively annihilated. Of the approximately 3,500 highly trained naval aviators who began the war, the vast majority were dead by its end. The 647 pilots who had participated in the Pearl Harbor attack, among them some of Japan's finest, were by 1945 almost entirely gone. Mitsuo Fuchida, who had led the attack on Pearl Harbor, survived the war, but only barely, and as one of the vanishingly few veterans of the original carrier strike force to do so. The Mitsubishi Zero, which had seemed in December 1941 to be the most fearsome carrier fighter on Earth, had been progressively outclassed, outproduced, and outflown until it became, by 1945, an aircraft that its designers themselves privately acknowledged was obsolete. Attempts to develop successors, the A7M Repu, the Mitsubishi J2M Raiden, were hampered by engine development problems, by material shortages, by the bombing of production facilities, and by the fundamental reality that Japan's industrial and technological infrastructure could no longer compete with what American industry was producing. 16 American pilots achieved ace status exclusively in the Corsair. Kenneth Walsh, with 21 kills, earned the Medal of Honor. Gregory Boyington, with 28 kills, earned the Medal of Honor. Robert Hansen, with 25 kills in 17 days, the most concentrated rate of aerial destruction in American aviation history, was killed in action before the Medal of Honor could be presented to him in person. These men are remembered rightly, but they are only the visible surface of a much larger story, the story of thousands of pilots, mechanics, logistics officers, training instructors, and factory workers who built the system within which these individual feats were made possible. What the bent wing taught the world, history, is rarely just. It does not distribute its lessons evenly or its consequences proportionally. The men who died in the Pacific, on both sides, in their thousands and tens of thousands, were in the most fundamental sense the victims of decisions made by others, in rooms they never entered, about strategies they never chose. The Japanese pilot who died in his burning Zero above Guadalcanal in 1943 was not less brave than the Marine Corsair pilot who killed him. He was simply operating within a system that was structurally incapable of matching what was being brought to bear against it. The F4U Corsair continued flying combat operations long after the Second World War ended. It flew in the Korean War, where it served with distinction against early jet aircraft, an anomaly that speaks to the fundamental soundness of its design. Marine Corsairs flew close air support missions over the frozen mountains of the Chosin Reservoir in December 1950, providing the fire support that allowed the 1st Marine Division to fight its way out of encirclement. The aircraft that many had dismissed as ungainly, as a bent-winged aberration, as a problem looking for a solution, proved adaptable in ways that no one had specifically designed it to be. The last combat use of the Corsair by any nation came in 1969, more than a quarter century after it first entered combat, during the brief football war between El Salvador and Honduras. By then, the aircraft was a relic by any objective measure, a piston engine anachronism in an age of supersonic jets. And yet it flew. It fought. It endured. Perhaps that is the truest thing that can be said about the Corsair. It endured. It endured the skepticism of its own navy, which initially refused to qualify it for carrier operations. It endured the contempt of Japanese pilots who dismissed it as overrated. It endured the mechanical challenges of its first operational year, when its quirks and vices killed men in training accidents almost as fast as the enemy killed them in combat. It endured all of this and emerged from the Pacific War as one of history's most effective combat aircraft. Not because it was perfect, but because the men who flew it, and the system that supported them, proved capable of turning its formidable raw attributes into devastatingly effective combat power. What the Japanese pilots over Guadalcanal, over Rabaul, over the Marianas and Leyte and Okinawa did not understand, what they could not fully understand until it was far too late, was that they were not facing merely a faster aircraft. They were facing an entire civilization's productive capacity, organized in the service of war, guided by doctrines refined through painful experience, and staffed by men who were neither less brave nor less dedicated than themselves, but who fought within a system designed to make individual bravery and individual dedication less critical to the outcome than the collective strength of the whole. The bent-winged Corsair was not just a fighter, it was a symbol of what industrial modernity could produce when it turned its full attention to destruction. Japan had gambled that the exceptional individual could overcome the systematic machine. The Corsair, roaring out of the Pacific sky at 417 miles per hour, answered that gamble with 11-to-1 certainty. The mathematics, as they always do, told the final story.